Hello, hello. The next one is a song from Palestine.
So welcome then to Radio Against Repression. This is going to be the podcast and radio hour that explores relationships between censorship and defunding and repression. There's a lot of moments that have led up to this point. Maybe it makes sense to try and explain a little bit who we are and how we arrived at this sort of difficult subject. My name's Alex Head. I'm an artist in Berlin for some time and interested in anti-racism and activism and writing about the history of authoritarian movements.
I'm Jewelz. I am a radio activist since a long time, and I came here because there was this resolution I think we're going to talk about later, and also because I think that talking about what's going on in Gaza or in the Middle East and in with the genocide and everything that's going on is very, very underrepresented in the German medias, and also not often there are places to hear these voices and these point of views. And I think, I would like to change that. And I'm also, of course, affected by these new laws that gonna come up. And I'm gonna give now to Jara.
Hi, I'm Jara. I'm a writer and anthropologist, and Jules and I study in the same university. That's how we know each other. I've been pretty active, let's say, for Palestine over the last 2 years, and for me, this is really about having these discussions of like what these policies actually mean. So, yeah.
The context that I met both of you really was during some strike action at the art school that you're both at, which was also opening the floor, as it were, to freelance artists to have discussions about what's going on and possible ways to collaborate. And around this time was also the leaking of the education resolution, which proposes to secure spaces for freedom of speech and does kind of quite the opposite. And I think that's an important part of the context. And I think that's the show that we are going to kind of present today, which has already aired, right? Maybe we just talk a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts of what's been going on in the last couple of months. So, we had that meeting, and then we went on air like 10 days later.
Yeah, well, thanks to Jules, who already had a show, and at the meeting basically was like, let's do it. Let's make this a show about repression, specifically focused against the Palestine Solidarity Movement. But obviously, this affects so many other people and factions and just aspects of life. It has this massive ripple effect, normalization of right-wing rhetorics and policies, and we're just really all, frogs in the boiling water with this.
And we also realized doing the first 2 shows that we already made, that were like pilot episodes, that there are a lot of topics and also a lot of reasons to talk about all these things that regards a lot of people. For example, all these laws that comes up now in Germany and all these repression structures are structures that now will install in other countries in Europe or otherwise too. And it's also a reason why we think it's very good and important that we do it in English. In the last 2 episodes, we switched from English to German, but then now we took the decision that we're going to talk in English. For me, it's not my mother tongue, or like I'm not so good, so I'm always a bit the slow one, and maybe I'm not going to understand everything, and then I have to ask you both again, Alex and Jara.
No problem from our side. I mean, translation was kind of the central motif of the first 2 shows, and you and I were reading the leaked draft resolution and then translating it into English. And that was also because the same motivation. Let's lift the rock on this and peer inside and see what's going on in the German political system, which is difficult to get access to because of the language barrier. But also, even if you're in Germany, I mean, this resolution draft was leaked. It wasn't made public. It was being voted on a few hours after the point where we were recording. And it really flies in the face of the democratic process. So to get that to an international audience, let's see how long we can do it. And we're also going to have community announcements, so fundraising for people who are going through the legal process or for families in Gaza, but also events, digital security events and other community projects and demonstrations here in Berlin. So stay tuned.
And also now, as you maybe hear, we are not all in the studio. So Alex and me, we are in the studio, and Jara via phone talking with us. So maybe the next time we're all going to be here.
Yeah, hopefully. Sorry for my mediocre sound quality. And yeah, we did some very intense, in effect, policy analysis in the first two pilot episodes. Just this question, like, what is this text? What does it mean? And even for German speakers, there's so much background information because that you need to understand these texts because they're not written honestly. They say, oh, we want to protect freedom of speech and academia, and what they mean is, oh, we want to protect Zionism. And it's very hard to dissect these texts if you don't, because they're dishonest, they're in bad faith. So that's what we were really engaging in, trying to dissect it.
Which applies, I think, also to the wider defunding of the arts in Berlin at the moment, which has created a schism between different groups who are affected, where one side, or let's say a particular way of seeing it, is that it matches certain types of censorial process that have been going on for the last year and a half around the genocide in Palestine and the wider region, insofar as it's artists who are speaking up and their freedom of expression, which is being directly cancelled. And on the other hand, you have the vast majority, I would say, who really just see this as kind of a bad budget that's come out of the government, of the previous coalition government, but it's continuing into the current coalition government, and that really these things are not related, and that the idea that the funding is about censorship is actually a diversion down a more political avenue than is warranted. And yet, at the same time, we all know that these budget cuts are proposed by the far-right so-called Alternative for Deutschland, clearly implementing a policy that reduces freedom of speech and freedom of expression and is divisive in its very intention. So this is also part of the urgency that we feel in having these conversations, and hopefully we'll have more direct interviews with people in the studio and guests, and we can really get into this particular contradiction.
Yeah, we plan a monthly show that's going to be hosted as a podcast, so you can listen to it online, but you can also listen to it live on air. It's going to be played every first Wednesday.
Yes.
My English.
First Wednesday.
The first Wednesday of the month. Every first Wednesday in Berlin on the 88.4, in Potsdam on the 90.7 from
5 to 6.
I'm so sorry. So it's going to be played every first Wednesday from 5 to 6 in Berlin on the 88.4 or in Potsdam on the 90.7, and you can just listen to it on air live, or you can just take a link and search for in the podcast applications you use for Radio Against Repression. Yeah,
Radio Against Repression. You can also support us. We are kind of doing this as an experiment to see if there is a receptive audience that can also imagine that this would be a valuable contribution to the discourse and to the landscape of conversation. So there is a Patreon, so patreon.com/Radio Against Repression. There will be some very accessible levels of membership, which are like small donations per month. We'll see what kind of like rewards, what can be made available there, maybe some publications from some of us. And it really helps, even if, there's not much money around these days, but it really helps to give a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you're using.
So I think now we maybe going to start with a resume or like something that we edited for you from the last episodes, what's about the resolution. So this resolution for education, and that was accepted in Germany in the last month, and that is can be very dangerous for freedom of speech and also freedom of, I don't know, political activism regarding you people at school or people at university, as for example Jara and I are. So maybe that's it for the introduction. What do you think, Jara? What do you think, Alex?
Enjoy the show, I would say. And the original pilot episodes that are a fun and interesting back and forth of German and English are also still online. So if you do speak German, you are very welcome to go listen to that as well.
Yeah, and that's at the mixcloud.com/Studio Ansager/Radio Against Repression Minuszeichnung 1. If you want the precise URL.
Go on Mixcloud and search for Radio Against Repression. I mean, and and if you're interested in more content, then just check out next month, because we're gonna prepare a lot of nice and interesting topics. We have a lot of ideas, and there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Radio Against Repression. This is episode 1, Policing Education, in which we give a subtextual reading of the parliamentary resolution, quote, confronting anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment at schools and universities and securing free space for debate, unquote, analysed with guests within and adjacent to contemporary formal education in Germany, sounding the alarm around shrinking spaces for free speech and expression, with guest contributions from Aviad Albert, an Israeli citizen working as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cologne, Thomas Herzmark, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Göttingen, and Carmen, an academic working in the field of religion in Germany. So let's get into it.
Radio Against Repression.
The Bundestag resolution on anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel in schools and universities aims to secure free space for discourse. As a postdoctoral researcher in German university who was born in Israel, Palestine, to a family of Jewish Zionists, I find this resolution is far more likely to do the exact opposite of what it aspires to achieve. This resolution treats anti-Semitism as a separate and unique type of discrimination, effectively creating an exclusive set of moral ethics for Jews in Germany. The self-defeating structure of this blatant contradiction should have been enough to kill this resolution, but apparently it wasn't. The mirror image of this problem is perhaps even worse. There are far more Arab and Muslim students than Jewish students in German universities, but this resolution has nothing to say about them or about Islamophobia more generally. With this absence, this resolution is essentially claiming that Islamophobia is not a serious problem in Germany. Likewise, this resolution opens by acknowledging the Hamas massacre of October 7th, but has nothing to say about the brutal Israeli onslaught that followed and resulted with credible accusation of war crimes and crimes against humanity coming from human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Israeli B'Tselem, and the legal institutions of the international community. The resolution makes multiple references to the history of the State of Israel, but not once mentioning the term Nakba, the resulting disaster of the Palestinian people. This resolution simply ignores Muslim and Arab students, ignores their discrimination, their fears, their history, their dispossession and dehumanization. Instead, it appears to further the silencing of Muslim and Arab members of the Academy and others showing solidarity with Palestine. This is done with threats of extrajudicial punishment using the administrative powers of institutions in the education space. This resolution is designed to silence dissent, not to secure free space. Another major problem with the suggested resolution is the complete and total conflation of anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel. The State of Israel and the Zionist project are political projects. Fierce criticism of political projects and ideologies should be legitimate if this resolution really cares to secure free space for discourse. As an anti-Zionist Jew who lives in Germany, I can attest to the fact that Jewish groups and individuals who join Palestinian solidarity protests and camps across Germany are accepted as partners with great enthusiasm. They are not hated because they are Jews, not even if they come from Israel. It's valuable to compare that with what we consider as classic anti-Semitism. While you can denounce Zionism in the eyes of the anti-Zionist, you cannot shed your Jewish identity in the eyes of the anti-Semite. The first case fosters a much-needed discussion, while the latter does not. People around me in the German academy are already afraid to talk, to speak their mind, to show solidarity with Palestine. They are afraid to stand for freedom and equal rights, afraid to repeat the accusation made by the most credible human rights organizations of the international community. People in the German academy are already afraid to lose jobs, contracts, funds, and enrollment status. Does anybody honestly believe that this resolution will secure the free space for discourse?
Reading here from the translation of the aforementioned resolution. Quote, a study by the University of Konstanz, commissioned by the German government in December 2023, shows that around 12% of students currently living in Germany consider the terrorist attack by Hamas to be part of Palestine's legitimate liberation struggle. The breeding ground for this threat is the open and violent anti-Semitism of Islamist, left-wing extremist and right-wing extremist actors. However, anti-Semitism also reaches deep into the center of society. Too often it has been underestimated how connectable anti-Semitic narratives and conspiracy ideologies are. Clearly, recognizing this is a prerequisite for effectively combating anti-Semitism. According to a study by the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, up to 24% of respondents exhibit entrenched anti-Semitic attitudes. With this motion, the German Bundestag is making its position very clear. Never again is now, unquote. Jara.
Yeah, so I'm not going to go into detail of every single of these words because we could nitpick this text until tomorrow morning, and that was actually what I spent last night and this morning doing. I'm going to publish it. I just want to go back just 1 second on this number of 4,782 anti-Semitic incidents. I actually went and I read that, or at least most of the study. They have basically no threshold of what they consider to be an anti-Semitic incident. Just someone has to say it was. Right. Which, of course, you can't, legally, you can't have a level that is so high as only if a court or an independent panel of experts has decided that an incident is anti-Semitic, can it be counted? But also, there was one of the incidents that is quoted was that a lady, and they don't even say if this woman was Jewish or not, put up after October 7th, put up an Israel flag in her window, and then someone threw eggs at it, and they're counting that as an anti-Semitic incident. Was this could just be because someone does not the colonial fascist state of Israel.
It's the conflation.
It's this conflation, and that conflation of Jewish people and the state of Israel is in itself an anti-Semitic trope, which just goes through this entire text. And another thing that goes through the entire text is, at least in other resolutions and in other texts, German Zionists will pay lip service to the fact that of course there is legitimate criticism of the state of Israel, and then in practice that is kind of boiled down to the only thing you're allowed to say is extremist settlers in the West Bank are bad. That's kind of the only type of criticism that is allowed in mainstream German media, but they're not even paying that lip service in this document.
Right. I seem to recall that Naomi Klein, when she was speaking with Mehdi Hassan last year, mentioned that when the British were drawing up the plans the Zionist plans for Israel in sort of 1920s, there was one Jewish member of the committee, and he himself said, "This is an anti-Semitic process. This is an anti-Semitic motion." So. Detached and then very conveniently conflated later on. A
friend of mine, H.P. Loveshaft, has a beautiful sermon that he wrote in November 2023 where he says the Zionists and the Nazis back in the 1930s worked together on the anti-Semitic project of removing the Jews from Europe.
It's 100 years later from the drawing up of these early Zionist plans.
My name is Carmen, and I'm working as an academic in the field of the study of religion in Germany. The draft resolution Antisemitismus und Israelfeindlichkeit an Schulen und Hochschulen entschlossen entgegentreten sowie den freien Diskursraum sichern will have, in my opinion, a very devastating impact on research and teaching in many disciplines and areas of study. And I will just highlight here 4 points that are quite important to my work. So the first point I want to raise is the political imposition of a specific definition of an approach to anti-Semitism. The resolution aims to turn the IRA working definition into a binding definition for schools and institutions of higher learning. So the IRA working definition, as many know, is highly controversial and very often conflates Israel with Jews. But apart from this, it is a very serious infringement of academic freedom to politically prescribe a definition of a phenomenon which scholars actually study. It is part of the scholarly work to produce definitions, debate them, and criticize them, and also change them. Basically, the resolution says, this is what anti-Semitism is, eat it, apply it, and tell us how we should combat what we have just arbitrarily defined while disregarding the debates of the last decades in the academic field. So this idea is inherently anti-scientific. In the extreme, part of the research and teaching being done in the field of anti-Semitism studies right now, or in the study of racism, genocide studies, Holocaust studies, and so on, can just simply not take place in Germany anymore. The second point I find very important is that anti-Semitism is cast in a singularity discourse. It is not framed as being part of, for example, a general study of racism, and it cannot be studied in its interlocking with other forms of racism in the course of its history. The assumption of the singularity and non-comparability of anti-Semitism underlying this resolution is, just like the IRA definition, highly contested, at least in non-German academia. Since what I have just said is very often interpreted as a relativization of the pain and the suffering of Jews, I should note here that comparison is not the same as conflation. That's just very simple, but many people don't understand this. Comparison does not imply that the things we compare lose their historical and contextual specificities, and that the pain and the terror of victims is talked down. Rather, comparison of different phenomena is at the core of scientific endeavors and methodology. Otherwise, we would only be describing single events or elements without being able to theorize and to understand, for example, patterns or structures. This third point I want to raise here is that legitimate research questions and results might become anti-Semitic on the basis of the resolution. There is a very weird sentence in the draft that is accessible to the public, and I will now quote in my own translation. I begin the quote. There is a consensus among those in positions of responsibility in science and research that scientific excellence and anti-Semitism are mutually exclusive. End of quote. Now, it sounds straightforward. Excellent projects receiving funding cannot be anti-Semitic, right? That's not a problem. But this depends on the definition of anti-Semitism. For instance, if I'm interested in the intersection between religion and the making of a Jewish nation-state, and if I understand the concepts of religion, Jewishness, and nation as historically situated, dynamic concepts, constructed and employed by human beings with specific interests and investments in these concepts, does my project become anti-Semitic and therefore not eligible for funding? Or, just to put it a bit differently, if I don't take national narratives for granted, as it's really common practice in relation to other nation states like Germany, and I want to investigate the national myth of Israel grounded in part in the Bible, will this be possible in German academia? Or will this be framed as questioning Israel's right to exist? At least there will be doubts, and this will lead to a chilling effect. Don't touch topics like these, even though they are very legitimate in relation to other countries. So the fourth point is that the resolution wants to ensure that university and high school students will get what it calls, quote, high-quality teaching, end of quote, about all world religions, the Middle East conflict, the history of Israel, Jewish history, Jewish culture, and contemporary Jewish life in Germany. This will, and here I quote again, remove the breeding ground for religious fanaticism, end of quote. This insinuates that the bottom problem is religious and religious fanaticism, and not, for instance, in the case of Palestine-Israel, the occupation, the repression and the ethnic cleansing of a people who have lived on the land before the establishment of the State of Israel, namely the Palestinians. The so-called Palestinian question, or the question of Palestine, does not appear in the parts of the resolution that relates to it. The so-called conflict has to do with claims to land and the unequal treatment of the Palestinians. If I teach world religions, students will learn nothing about the roots and the history of what is happening today. It is at best infantilizing, and at worst it is gaslighting to think that some knowledge of so-called world religions and some interreligious dialogue is appropriate to get a grip on what is happening in Palestine-Israel. And then what about Jews who don't care about Israel or who are anti-Zionist, even worse? Just lately, the anti-Semitism coordinator of Baden-Württemberg, Michael Blume, has conflated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. This seems to be a cornerstone of combating anti-Semitism in Germany. Can I at university, in, for example, a teacher training program, discuss different texts of people who understand themselves as Jews, in which a range of positions towards Israel is articulated? And can I do this without framing anti-Zionist Jewish voices as anti-Semitic? Or are the latter not to be considered as real authentic Jews? And this would be quite a move coming from a self-proclaimed secular state, and especially coming from the successor state to Nazi Germany. So up to this point, we could all say, all right, the resolution is utter nonsense, let's simply ignore it. But if we add the demand of the resolution that the German government should, in collaboration with the federal states, quote, work towards initiating a structural dialogue between institutions of higher learning and security services, end of quote, and that, quote again, the exchange between institutions of higher learning and security services should be intensified and expanded, end of quote, it becomes really scary. Even more so in relation to schools where the targets are vulnerable minors. This resolution betrays a very fraught and dangerous vision of the function of education in society that wants to understand itself as liberal, secular, and democratic.
So this is the bit where we shamelessly ask you for your support. If you think this content is important and you'd like the podcast to get its wings, consider supporting us on patreon.com/Radio Against Repression.
Reading here from the translation of the aforementioned resolution. Quote, anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel must have no place in schools and universities. We are committed to ensuring that Jews can live, teach and learn without fear and discrimination. Against this background, we welcome the commitment of the Federal Minister of Education and Research, Bettina Stark-Watzinger, and the entire federal government and the science and education ministers of the federal states to Jewish pupils, students and teachers against anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel. At schools and universities, it is becoming increasingly apparent that openly anti-Semitic and anti-constitutional statements are being made and acts committed under the guise of freedom of expression. Increasingly, people and groups from outside are abusing an open and democratic discourse space for their propaganda. Systematic attempts are being made to create a climate of insecurity and fear in schools and universities and to establish an anti-Semitic interpretation of the Middle East conflict. Even if anti-Semitic and terror-glorifying slogans were often only uttered by small groups, only some of which consisted of students at the respective university or pupils at the respective schools, they were still able to attract a great deal of attention. Unquote. I mean, yeah. There's a reason why we're not only reading this the whole hour and a half, because, you know, we would like to go home sane, relatively sane.
Oh, I think that
ship has
fun. Oh yeah, that's how you say it in English. That ship has
sailed.
In German, it's the train that's leaving. In English, it's the ship.
What have you learned, Germany? Are you afraid to hear this, Germany? Why am I talking to you, Germany? Are you listening, Germany?
This is subtext.
Are you listening, Germany? Are you listening, Germany?
Hello, my name is Thomas Herzmark, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Göttingen in Germany. I trained as a social anthropologist, and my research has focused on the UK and on India. One of the areas I've investigated is how state affirmative action and protective policies based on people's identities have been experienced across generations. State interventions targeted to protect particular groups, whether ethnic, cultural or religious, always run the risk of essentialising and further stereotyping the communities that they single out for protection. In the case of the Bundestag resolution that purports to challenge anti-Semitism in German schools and universities, it's extraordinary to me to read how little care has been taken over the way Jewish people are represented in this text. The wording seems to presume that Jewish people are external to Germany, and that intercultural understanding can be fostered by an initiative to, quote-unquote, meet a Jew, as if an individual Jewish person could be representative of the entire religious community. Furthermore, the resolution repeatedly lumps together Jewish life and support for Israel. While many Jews do feel a close affinity with Israel, there are many Jewish voices in Germany, across Europe and around the world who do not feel represented by the State of Israel, and many who explicitly oppose the Israeli military's horrific persecution of Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. Obviously, it's not the case that criticisms of the actions of a nation-state should be considered as a form of prejudice against that nation's majority population. To assume that all Jewish people hold an allegiance to Israel is highly reductive, and in fact, that assumption is itself anti-Semitic. So, from the perspective of protective state intervention, it's extremely difficult to take this resolution at face value. Given the global and national context and the timing, and reading the terrifying clauses that indicate universities and schools should be opened up to security forces to police political debate, it seems clear that this is actually a measure designed to repress criticism of the ongoing actions of the Israeli military, which the German government supports. In the context of the horrific assault on Gaza, which has killed thousands and thousands of civilians, including hundreds of university staff, teachers, journalists and medics, in response to the attack of the 7th of October 2023, it's entirely reasonable that people on German university campuses call for Palestinian life to be protected and speak out against the German government's support of continued Israeli aggression. This resolution comes at a time when every single university in Gaza has been severely damaged or destroyed, and 88,000 students are without a campus. The damage to educational, medical and civilian infrastructure make it clear that horrendous violations of international law have been committed, and that's been happening with the explicit support and diplomatic cover of the German government as well as the UK and US governments. As a university educator myself, I believe it's critical to work consistently to oppose all forms of racism and anti-Semitism, and that's why I wish to publicly denounce this resolution. It has no grounding in anti-discrimination research, and it should not be passed. Most disturbingly, this resolution panders to the agenda of the extreme right-wing factions of the German political spectrum. It locates the debate about anti-Semitism with people from outside Germany, as if anti-Semitism in Germany had only sprung up following recent waves of migration. This is straightforwardly false, xenophobic and racist, and I was genuinely shocked to see this rhetoric coming from mainstream political organisations, including the SPD and the Green Party. The resolution speaks of diversity on our campuses, leading to the abuse of free speech, but it ignores a key finding of the research on anti-Semitism from Constance University in 2024, which noted that universities were spaces with less anti-Semitism compared to wider society. The resolution privileges a narrow and monolithic idea of Jewish people, and in particular Jewish organisations that support the Israeli government, above other German citizens, above the education and political freedoms of German students, teachers and staff. The resolution reinforces anti-Palestinian racism. As such, this is a manifestly discriminatory resolution that explicitly protects some lives above others. It weaponizes the protection of one minority to suppress criticism of the annihilation of another.
Au plus j'ai la haine, au plus ils me font de la peine. Ce n'est pas un drame si je ne fais plus la fête. Ou s'il serait, nous fais-tu jeter la guerre. La vie est une chienne qu'il faut m'échaîner et des gens que j'aime. Nanana. Seul, je veux être seul.
So to delve into a few more of the cracks in the armor of this sort of farcical but incredibly violent text. Jewelz, another minute and then another minute.
Schulen sind Orte der Vielfalt, aber auch Spiegelbild gesellschaftlicher Konflikte.
Quote, schools are places of diversity, but also a reflection of social conflicts. An increasingly diverse student body means that different religious and cultural backgrounds come together. Teachers and educational staff are therefore faced with the even greater challenge of creating a climate of cohesion and mutuality in addition to the actual teaching. However, they must also be able to recognize anti-Semitism and hostility toward Israel and take decisive action against it. This includes preventing prohibited statements and actions wherever they occur. This applies both in the classroom and in the school playground. They must also communicate why anti-Semitism and hostility toward Israel are unacceptable in Germany and beyond.
Yeah.
And it's not representative. I think it's good to point that out as well. Like sure, it will probably be passed this evening as a resolution, but it doesn't represent all of Germany. This is a fucking massive power grab.
It's completely anti-democratic.
Yeah.
Because again, we're reading a draft that is 3 months old and it's supposed to be passed in a few hours. It's completely being decided upon, with exclusion of the civil society, of experts, of legal experts, etc., etc. But also, honestly, to a large part by the people who will be voting for it, because this was also just decided and written by a handful of people from the parliamentarians. And we see that with the other resolution that was passed in November, that there was a leak because people who were working on the draft got really concerned about where it was going. And then afterwards, even more people were excluded from writing it. So it was an even smaller circle of parliamentarians who were then writing this resolution. So this is a completely anti-democratic attempt to silence people.
Yeah, it seems to speak to the feeling I have, anyhow, of a kind of rabbit in the headlights moment in German politics, where everyone is just so overwhelmed, apparently, that they cannot look at the basic building blocks of how this parliamentary system is supposed to work.
I mean, of course, it's also kind of shock doctrine,
100%.
So much is happening. Even earlier today, the CDU, I don't actually know if they passed it, probably did, brought in a resolution that's really racist and anti-asylum. And then they changed the voting time for this resolution from tomorrow to today. They changed that yesterday.
Yeah.
Tonight at 8 p.m. where, that's not the time you have a serious political debate if you're interested in that. And it's really just an attempt to push so much through as fast as possible with as little civil oversight as possible.
Yeah. Welcome back to Radio Against Repression. We're here in the studio. Jewelz and myself have been reading the German and then translating into the English. Only the draft, which has come out 3 months ago because it's been so sort of surreptitious and clandestine that we haven't got the full resolution, which is being voted on this evening, as we've been talking about. Jara, you've been pretty active in the movement against the genocide in Palestine, and you've seen and have a strong insight into some of the physical violence which has been occurring on campus over the last year and a half. Perhaps we should not let this go without inclusion in the show. Maybe we should speak about that. What's on the top of your mind when it comes to this sort of events, or where did it start?
I mean, the top of my mind, the first thing I think of is that the violence on campus is the same as the violence on the streets. Like, we have actual cases of police violence against students on campus. There's been several occupations of universities around Germany, not by far as strong as the movement in the US was. But for instance, the very first that I know of was in December 2023, where a couple of students occupied a auditorium at FU Berlin, like Freie Universität Berlin. And they announced that they would hold this occupation for 24 hours, which, was kind of standard. It's students that want a space to do something. University didn't give it to them, so they took it. And they hung up posters, with like murdered people in Gaza and facts and stuff. And Zionist students came and tore it down. And were then also physically violent towards the occupiers. And then the university forced the occupiers to let in these disruptive Zionist students and claimed that, and then there was this claim that these Zionist students were being excluded because they were Jewish. Like, no, you're being excluded because you went up and you ripped down the posters. Right. And you physically shoved people out of the way to get to these posters, to tear them down. And now you're claiming that's because of because you're a Jew, you're not being let in there. Well, there's Jewish people in the occupation. You're not being let in because you're physically disruptive. But even after then the occupiers caved and they let them in, the university called the police, and 200 cops in full riot gear came and evicted them.
Jesus.
With a lot of physical violence. And I used to go to that university, to FU, and, back then, this was before we really got accustomed to seeing police on campus. And to see the videos and pictures of all of these cops, again, in full riot gear, dragging people through the halls of my own university. Yeah. It's insane.
Yeah. It's a throwback to 70s imagery.
Absolutely. And we have so many examples of that. There was the occupation at HU Berlin, where the sort of story is, and obviously it's kind of hard to then definitively know these things, but that the president of HU, actually the Humboldt University, actually didn't want to evict the occupation. And then Kai Wegner, the governor, the mayor, that's the word, Regierender Bürgermeister of Berlin, said, no, we're going to send the police in anyway. So he also just completely broke with, the freedom of independence of the university. We have a politician sending cops to a university against the wishes, allegedly, of the president of the university. And at that occupation, this was in May 2024, the cops beat up a journalist, and they arrested the lawyer of the students, and they arrested medics, and they obviously arrested and beat up a whole bunch of students.
Yeah.
We just have an insane authoritarian drift. And of course, this is we have massive police violence on the streets as well. The police just, beat up protesters every single day.
Yeah. Yeah, and whereas, education was arguably a larger part of the sort of national branding of Germany, and police violence on the streets was, again, something which, the way the police speak now, it's kind of, no, it's all managed. It's just a managerial problem. It's just, we're just going to manage the situation, and there are lots of regulations in the book, and we follow the book. But in any case, the idea of like violence in the streets is something you would associate with Berlin, 70s, 80s, 90s. It wasn't so far away from the imagination.
Yeah, but we really see how the violence has gotten so much worse, like both on the streets and in campus and everything. And there's one example, this was last week, on the 20th of January, where, and it's also said in this resolution, like, oh, you know, universities and schools have to be a space for dialogue. So in München, a group of students invited the university administration to a dialogue, the thing that this resolution claims it wants. And which obviously, you know, schools and educational facilities should be a space for, to talk about the university's complicity in the genocide in Gaza. Because it's a technical university, Munich, so it has cooperations with technical universities in Israel that, like, actively support the military. And the students showed up to this event, and there's actually a video where students were, like, hesitant to go into the room. Probably because they could sense like they could just see them on the video being like, eh. And then security guards and university administrations wave them into the room. So they go into the room, and not even 5 minutes later, exactly when the dialogue was supposed to start, the police shows up and locks the students in the room. So this is the dialogue.
God almighty.
That the university, with its own students, it locks them into a room and then left them there for multiple hours, and like wouldn't allow them to use the bathroom without
it's an absolute
escort, a police escort.
Yeah. It's like an absolute panic attack, like panic response. You know, someone wants to question the status quo. What do we do? Not just shut them down, but like actually lock them, like actually incarcerate them temporarily.
Yeah.
I mean,
on university grounds.
Yeah.
And charge them.
As though the world is not watching, you know. That's the thing. Yeah, unfortunately, many more examples, but we needn't, I guess, labor the point. I guess the thing with the public police confrontation, which is escalating to violence, is also, yes, it existed, and yes, it happens in other ways, but it's very targeted at this point, right? It's the violence is saved for the pro-Palestinian demonstrators. It's
I would say not only. We also see how, I mean, especially for the Kurdish movement, this has been going on for years. But also climate activism has more and more been met with really very violent police response. This is more of a general movement, which is also a general trend across mostly like Western countries, to see protest as something that is irritating and actually threatening to democracy that needs to be clamped down upon, as opposed to protests being a part of a vital democracy.
Yeah. And these are peaceful protests. I mean,
yeah, and even if not, you know, what is throwing a water bottle against a sea of cops that are, you know, they're trained, they're wearing helmets, they have guns, they have pepper spray, they have tasers, they've brought dogs to pro-Palestine protests. You just cannot compare whatever violence, like even if, you know, some people might have been resisting arrest or whatever.
Sure.
Or like if a cop grabs you from behind, yeah, you're going to try and shake them off. That's going to be an automatic reaction.
Yeah. You are not welcome on the street is the message that
exactly.
is conveyed by this. Yeah,
and true. It doesn't actually matter what you do.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you're peaceful or not.
Yeah.
And it's also just an insane assumption to be like, oh, you're like, again, these people are protesting genocide. Or in the case of the climate justice movement, these people are protesting the destruction of all viable life.
And we've
that
done
is
20
already
years.
violent.
Yeah. It's so super twisted. And like also it's been 20 years. I mean, I've been watching and participating in climate protests for 20 years. I have been watching people say we can't go above 1.5 for over 20 years, and we're going into 2. So anyhow.
And you're situating, but what is being done narratively is to situate the violence just on the side of the people resisting.
Yeah.
And to then position the status quo as nonviolent, and that's just not true.
Yeah. You've been listening to Radio Against Repression, and as we've been finishing these last bits of posts, there are reports coming in about EU nationals without criminal records being ordered to leave the country in connection with their pro-Palestine activism. So, truly chilling, and clearly we'll try and have a lot more about this in the following episodes. Do tune in again. That's the first Wednesday of each month on 88.4 FM in Berlin. You can find us at Radio Against Repression. Just drop it into any of your podcast platforms. Give us a 5-star rating. Thank you so much for engaging, and thanks everyone for all of their effort and their work so far. The bridging music that you've heard today is from the Khaled Kurba and Raman Khalaf Ensemble. Khaled has a couple of gigs coming up the 5th of April. I hope I pronounced this right, at Mahmat. That's Grunwaldstrasse 55 in Berlin. And then he has another gig on the 17th of April at Galileakirche. That's Riegerstrasse 9 in Berlin. The bridging music that you're listening to now is by Tim Lang. Yeah, see you next time. Those who control language control the nature of reality. So speak to each other. When you see repression, speak up.